To speak to us tonight, and we appreciate on FDR and the funeral train. Thank you, David.
Okay. This program was developed by my wife, who was born and raised in Hyde Park, New York, which is Roosevelt territory. I mean, everything, Roosevelt had a lot going on there. He has his mansion and his estate, and I know elementary school groups would go and visit the estate. Anne actually graduated from Roosevelt High School, so she had Roosevelt in her blood. When she realized that the funeral train came past Greenville and Spartanburg from Warm Springs, Georgia, where he passed away, she got interested in that, did a lot of research, and pulled this program together. So, again, that's Hyde Park, New York, where she was born and raised. And the FDR home and library are there. And the dog was called the Informer. Because if you saw the dog, you knew Roosevelt was in the area. Okay. A little bit of his history. He was born in 1882. He worked as a senator in New York, an assistant secretary of Navy. He was a running mate with James Cox for the vice presidency in 1920. Obviously, he didn't get elected. In 21, he was diagnosed with polio, but then in 29 to 32, he was governor of New York, and then 33 to 45 was president, and then April 12th, he died while in office. So he had quite a political history. But he and Eleanor did a lot of traveling on trains. That's an early photo of them. There's another one. But he did a lot with campaigning with trains. He did a lot across the country with that. Here's a picture of him with Mayor A.C. Mann in 1932. And so in addition to just traveling for his own purposes, campaigning by train was a big deal. I mean, we're talking the 30s when that was the main mode of transportation in the country, was by train. He went out to all parts of the U.S., including Laramie, here in 32. Okay. This whole program was written with the railroad and the trains in mind, not the people. Okay, so we're going to talk about the trains. And I have a couple of books, I'll show you later, that if you want to get into the people and their interaction during all of this, it's there, but it's not in this program. Okay. So, the Pullman Company, if you're anyone unfamiliar with the Pullman Company, they built passenger cars and dining cars and leased them to the railroads. And they built 6 business cars, and they named each of them after an explorer. They called them the Explorer cars. They had an observation room, a couple of bedrooms, a dining area, and a kitchen. And they were all observation cars. They'd be the last car on the train. There's the Henry Stanley. That was purchased by the Santa Fe Railroad. This is, it was later repainted and renamed. The Livingston was sold to the New York Central. It became New York Central 18, and then it was sold to a railroad in Mexico. The Robert Peary. In 1939, you could rent the Robert Peary for $105. Roosevelt used it 34 times from 1934 to 1936. It's now at a railroad museum in Campo, California. So some of these have been saved. We know where most of them are. That's the Roald Amundsen. Was used by President Hoover, President Roosevelt, President Truman, General Eisenhower, and Roosevelt met with Canadian Prime Minister King in Ogdensburg, New York on that and signed the NORAD Treaty. It was sold to New York Central, and it is now in a railroad park in Scottsdale, Arizona. If I called somebody a rivet counter, would you know what I'm talking about? Okay. Those people who do model trains, there are people who like you to model something exactly like the prototype, okay? And there are comments like, that's not right, because there were 17 rivets here on the prototype and you've only got 16. So this is not a true model of that prototype. But I want you to take a look at rivets on the Marco Polo. And you can see that there's quite a number of them on that car. But we'll get back to that in shortly here. But the Marco Polo was built in 27, and it was used by Roosevelt quite a bit between 33 and 40. And he had the car modified so that he could maneuver in it with his polio handicap. It was sold to the Central of Georgia and renamed the Savannah. And the Central of Georgia became part of Southern Railway. And after the merger with Norfolk and Western, the car was refitted and renamed back as the Marco Polo. And it was in Washington, D.C., and it was used by Norfolk Southern and Amtrak for meetings in Washington, D.C. But it is now in the Southeastern Railroad Museum in Duluth, Georgia. And we had a field trip from our organization down to Duluth to take a look at this, and we couldn't find it. And we were talking to the folks, and they said, we can give you a special viewing. It's not open to the public, because one of the restrictions that they had on the car was that it needed to maintain air conditioning and heating throughout the year, or else it wasn't going to be loaned to them. And they said, yeah, we can do that, we can do that. They didn't realize that the car was 480 volt, not 220 volt. So they didn't have the voltage, the electrical system, where they wanted to display it. So I don't know whether they have gotten to that point yet or not, but they had it back in their shops where they had 480 volt service in order to keep the AC going in it. And there it is when it was in Central of Georgia. Now the Ferdinand Magellan was actually turned into US 1, which would have been the railroad version of Air Force One, okay, for the president. But because of World War II, they felt that car needed more security, so they reinforced it with 5/8-inch armor plate. They put special trucks and couplers on it. They put 3-inch bulletproof glass in the car. Wow. They had 2 escape hatches. I'm not sure Roosevelt could maneuver out of those hatches if he needed to, but yeah, the back door was 1,500 pounds, and the car weighed 140 tons. We've heard comments from engineers, we've seen comments from engineers in the print, that they hated this car on a train because it weighed so much at the end of the train that if they stopped, the momentum from that car on the end of the train was they had to be very careful with this car. It was not the easiest car to deal with. So there's the Ferdinand Magellan. Now, look at the rivets now after they went and did the revision to that car to make it more secure. Here's some interior shots of it.
Pretty elegant. Yeah.
This is, I don't know if this is Roosevelt's room? It could be. There's an escape hatch in the ceiling. I just don't know how he would be able to maneuver that. Now, he was a very well-traveled president. He had 399 trips by rail, almost 250,000 miles. He had 83,000 miles by sea and 26,000 miles by air. And that rail mileage exceeds 10 times around the distance of the globe. So he did a lot of traveling. Again, campaigning. Here he is with his son James. They did special bulletins and menus when he was on the train. Here he is in Greenville speaking. The crowd of 1,000 who gathered at midnight on August 11th. I tell you, we have a member in our organization who is a rivet counter in a lot of different ways. And when Ann put this together, she said, Governor Olin D. Johnson. And he said, I think you've got that wrong. His name was Johnston with a T. And she said, I wasn't sure that was right, but that's the way it was on the document that I got this information from, so I kept it that way. And but he is a model train expert in Lionel, and he would know that, oh, that screw is brass, not aluminum. Therefore, it was built in 1945 because they went to aluminum in 1947. Okay, so. Here's some more either menus that they would use. In 1944, Roosevelt was in declining health, and he spent a lot of time in Georgetown, South Carolina, and he was reelected for the 4th term. Does anybody know what the 260 over 150 is? No, that's his blood pressure. So, again, 1945, they didn't have all the medications we have today. So, he traveled to Yalta to meet with Churchill and Stalin. And when he returned from that trip, the comment was that he looked haggard, frail, and bloodless. So he was hurting when he came back from Yalta. Now, in March 29th of 45, he ended up traveling to Warm Springs, Georgia. And there is the consist of the train. I don't see the locomotive number on there, but there was a couple of cars, and the car before the private car, number 1, was a Pontiac, and that was a car that was used by the Secret Service. Now, Warm Springs, Georgia is somewhere in this area here. But you can see that the Southern Railway system goes from Atlanta through Greenville and Spartanburg to Charlotte and up toward to Washington, D.C. But he was always drawing a crowd whenever he went to Warm Springs, Georgia. They loved him down there, and he loved the facility. He thought that the springs did help him health-wise some, but it also gave him a chance to get out of the rat race in D.C. and relax. That's a picture of him. He visited Warm Springs 16 times while he was president. Now, there's a lot of discussion about the Little White House. It's not that it was a replica of the Washington, D.C. White House. It just was a little white house in Warm Springs, but that's where he stayed. Now, at this trip, there was an artist who was with him who was doing a portrait of him. And she got this far. I don't have the documentation with me, but he didn't look good. She commented to him. He ended up complaining about a headache and then slumped over. And with the blood pressure he had, he ended up with a stroke and had and he didn't make it from there. So the country was notified that he had died in Warm Springs. Here's the Spartanburg Herald. At Warm Springs, he had a typical route that he would follow to get to the little White House. And the people in Warm Springs would be out lining the street. And the fella playing the accordion, that became a very well-known photo of him in tears playing the accordion at Roosevelt's death. Okay. They ended up calling to Atlanta and saying, we need a mortician in Warm Springs, Georgia. And he came down. Now, Roosevelt was not a small guy. They could not get the casket into US 1 by taking a window out. It just wouldn't fit. The windows in the Pontiac were bigger, so they ended up switching the two cars, made the Pontiac the last car of the train, and put the casket in there. They rigged some kind of platform to raise it up so it could be seen through the windows, and the flag, of course, was over it. But I don't know exactly how long it took them to get everything ready for the trip back to Washington, D.C. But because the train is not on the main, the Warm Springs is not on the main line, they could not bring their typical locomotives that run on the main line to get the train. They had to use what they called a pair of light Pacifics. And let's see, well, I'm getting ahead of myself, but there's a photo of it, and they had a lot of military there, always present during the whole trip. So he went from Warm Springs to Atlanta, through Greenville, Spartanburg, and up to Washington, D.C. He was put in a state in Washington for the afternoon, then in the evening loaded back on the train and headed up to Hyde Park, New York.
What year was that?
1945.
For the whole trip, 1945.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are the light Pacifics, number 1263 and 1337, who ended up going to Warm Springs and taking it back to Atlanta. Now, I don't know how many of you ever rode on a train that was powered by a steam engine, but they could only go so far, and then they'd have to get new water and coal. So a lot of times they would just change engines with a fresh pair of engines, which they did multiple times along the route coming back up to Washington. But in Atlanta, they got rid of the light Pacifics, and here he is coming into Atlanta, and there was always a lot of military and other folks just lining the tracks the whole way. Again, there's his valet, Arthur Prettyman, and Fala was the name of the dog that was the president's. The heavy Pacifics, 1394, kind of like this 1394. This is a headlight off of one of those locomotives. But they used the heavy Pacifics on the main line starting in Atlanta And those went from Atlanta to Greenville. There was some discussion about this photo. It says that that's the Roosevelt train en route to Washington, crossing the bridge over the Kiowa River. And I asked the question, was it the Kiowa River or was it the Saluda River? Where did the Kiowa River end and the Saluda River start? There's still not a clean answer to that, I don't think. But you can see down lower, they had raised the track up because they're going to flood this and create Lake Hartwell. I think it's Hartwell, or is it? So the track used to be down lower on these platforms here. But they put the new bridge in at a higher elevation because of the flooding that was going to occur. There he is near Clemson. The Clemson cadets came out in force, and if you look real close, we think it's cadets, and could be press on the roof of the depot. People came from all over to see the funeral train go by. There he is pulling into Greenville, and you can see the population that's there. Another shot in Greenville. We like this photo, where it says Getty Images, the little boy behind it. They may have put up a rope to keep people back there, but he didn't think that meant to keep him back. So, and I don't know if that soldier's going to do anything or say anything, but. And there is this plaque in Greenville near Willard Street, which is just south of the depot, near the Swamp Rabbit Trail, and it talks about the train coming through, and there was a group who sang a song while they were there. We think that, a group of children were singing a song. We're not sure which song it was and whether they've got it right on the plaque or not. But that's down near where Unity Park is now, I think. Eleanor sent a telegram from Greenville to Washington and said, here's the list of folks I want on the train from Washington to Hyde Park for the funeral. Quite a list. Different set of locomotives from Greenville to Salisbury. And this is interesting. 1401 is the locomotive that's now in the museum in Washington, the Smithsonian. 1385, the fireman said his name was Box Childer. They called him Box. And we have his grandson visiting us at the museum. I'm not sure why they called him Box. It wasn't his real name. But it said the parentheses COL. Anybody got a clue what that indicated? He was colored. He was the only colored railroad employee on any of the locomotives that pulled this train. And that's him. His grandson brought this newspaper clipping to us. It was not in the best of shape. And there's 1401. And there's 1401 in the Smithsonian, painted green, which this railroad did for their passenger trains at one point. This is a photo in Spartanburg. The train that's in the background is not the funeral train. We believe that's a train that's going to end up going to Columbia. The Baber Rhine building is still there. The Morgan Hotel is not there anymore. Neither is the structure there to the far left that's elevated. That would house people, a railroad employee who would look at the train traffic and the railroad and the automobile traffic and close the gates for the automobiles. But there were a lot of folks came out to see the train. We understand the train came in after sunset. So these folks were here for a while. And it's interesting to look at all the men in their suits and all the ladies in their skirts, which if we did that today, it'd be a total different picture. But there it is. That's when it came through Spartanburg. Now from Salisbury, North Carolina to Monroe, Virginia, again, a different set of locomotives. And groups like the Lions Club and others would come out with flowers and put it into the train. Monroe, Virginia to Washington, D.C., another set of locomotives. That's Monroe, Virginia, with the roundhouse and turntable there. Charlottesville, again, folks coming out at night. They wouldn't let them on the platforms, so they were all on the bridge up above, and it's over here to the right. That's a shot that's supposedly taken about 23 miles south of Washington, D.C., and that's at Union Station in Washington. Okay, we'll get into a little bit about the people. Truman was the vice president, and now he's president. And there was a comment made by, when Truman called Eleanor and told Eleanor that Franklin had died, and he expressed his concerns, and she said, "Don't worry about me. You're the one we need to worry about." Do you know who James Burns is? And Burns High School in Spartanburg is named after him. Burns was in the cabinet of Roosevelt's cabinet, and was, I don't know if he was Secretary of War, but he was really in the loop on the atomic bomb being made. And Truman was not. Truman was clueless. So when Truman became president, he knew he needed to have Burns as part of his cabinet. Burns left the cabinet because Roosevelt did not select Burns as his vice presidential candidate in his last election. Truman needed Burns to help educate him on what was going on. So they took FDR's coffin out of the rail car and put it on this horse-drawn, what do we call those? Caisson. And he went down, I assume, the main street in Washington. And he was put in the East Room at the White House, where they kept him. Again, not for long, for several hours, but mostly the afternoon of that day. One of the handouts regarding that. The pallbearers then put the casket back into the train at Union Station, again at night. They published the schedule. I don't know that we would do that today, to publish the schedule of where that train was going to be when. If somebody wanted to do something, they knew exactly where to go. But he was going to leave Washington at 10 o'clock at night, and he was going to arrive at Hyde Park at 8:40 in the morning. So there's not a whole lot of photographs of the trip from Washington to New York, because it was all in the middle of the night. When he got to Washington, D.C., they used these electric locomotives instead of the Southern Railway steam locomotives. Now, it's a tricky situation in New York City to get from, in 1945, to get from Penn Station basically over to Grand Central Station with the train and get it on the line to go up the east side of the Hudson River. They needed New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad electrics, and they had to pull the train and then back it in, and I'm still not sure I know all the details, but it was quite a convoluted train maneuvering to get this train to where it needed to be. Because they pulled the train through the East River Tunnel at Hell's Gate Bridge to New Rochelle and then back down to Mott Haven where the New York Central took over. So on the train that went from Washington, D.C., from New York City to Hyde Park was a J1-D Hudson from New York Central. But they had a second train. They actually had two trains. They had a train with all of these folks that Eleanor wanted at the funeral in the congressional train, and it led the way, and then the FDR Funeral Train was behind it. That's about the one good photo that anybody has of the train coming up the Hudson River toward Hyde Park in the morning. And some people have said, well, why did they only need one locomotive here when on Southern Railway they needed two locomotives? Well, the New York Central's nickname was the water level route. So there were very, very few, if any, grades on that rail line. So it was flat. So they could use one locomotive, whereas to go from Atlanta to Washington, there were places where they needed the two locomotives. There's another photo of it going through the tunnel near Bear Mountain. That's the station in Hyde Park, New York. In 1945, they put some bunting up and tried to make it look decent. If you're familiar with the topography along the Hudson River's down here, and then the topography, it rises up. So where they were going to bury him is up here, but the train is down here. And it took them a while to get him, well, a couple things. They didn't have enough vehicles to take everybody who was on that congressional train up to the burial site. They had to call taxi cabs, and people had to share rides, and it was quite a mess. But they had a case on there to carry him up. But these horses had their work cut out for them to go up the grade to get up to the burial site, which is here. And the train is, I still don't know how it was done. They turned the locomotive somewhere around so that it could go back to New York. I don't know. I know there's a turntable in Poughkeepsie, which was about 10 miles south. I don't know what was north, other than I know there's a Y in Rensselaer near Albany. So I don't know how exactly they turned that locomotive around to be able to head south. There's Truman. That's where he is buried and how it looks. I haven't been there lately, so I'm assuming it still looks about the same at the home and library. Yeah. These two books that I brought, if you want to get into more detail, this one, the subtitle, it's FDR's Funeral Train, but the subtitle is A Betrayed Widow, a Soviet Spy, and a Presidency in the Balance. So this goes into the people side of it more than anything I did here. And this is The President Travels by Train. talks about Roosevelt, but also talks about other presidents who use the train for travel. So both of these are very good books. Do we have time for a 4.5-minute video? That's a typical picture of Roosevelt with his cigarette holder.
Welcome to the Hyde Park train station. The first station was built here by the Hudson River Railroad in 1850. The 2-track main line ran freight as well as passenger service. In 1861, Abraham Lincoln's presidential inauguration train came to Hyde Park. In 1865, President Lincoln's funeral train came through, the opposite direction of the inauguration train 4 years before. Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt also had his interest in the railroad. The former shipping mogul was competing with a rival shipper that was buying Pennsylvania Railroad stock. In 1913, the Hudson River Railroad and New York Central Railroad expanded to a 4-track main line. Every station along the way from New York City to Albany was demolished. The new station was built in 1914. The Vanderbilts preferred the look of the Santa Fe Railroad in the Southwest. Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt used the station often. When FDR was governor, the railroad provided a direct connection to the state capital in Albany. In 1939, the King and Queen of England visited the station. After visiting the World's Fair in Flushing Meadows, Queens, the King and Queen of England drove to Hyde Park, New York. Upon finishing their lunch with the Roosevelts, the King and Queen came to the Hyde Park station and boarded a royal train and headed to Canada. During World War II, the station was used frequently to move troops, Secret Service agents, and other important politicians and dignitaries that came to Hyde Park. In April of 1945, FDR passed away in Warm Springs, Georgia. His body was carried up the East Coast to Washington for a formal funeral ceremony. Then his funeral train came from Washington, D.C. up to Hyde Park, New York. In 1959, the New York Central, going through a period of decline, closed the Hyde Park station, as well as many other small stations along the line. Also in 1959, the movie North by Northwest, starring Cary Grant, was shot in Hyde Park and used the station as a backdrop. The property was eventually turned over to the town of Hyde Park. They allowed a youth group to run meetings there, but the station was badly vandalized and slated for demolition. In 1975, the Hudson Valley Railroad Society came in with an 11th-hour proposal to save the station. That year, the Hudson Valley Railroad Society received grant money from IBM to restore the windows in preparation for the PBS movie Eleanor and Franklin. Various scenes of the movie were shot in the station, and eventually the station was restored enough to allow a train of reporters to come up to Hyde Park, New York, and view the premiere of the movie in the Roosevelt Theater. Today, the Hudson Valley Railroad Society maintains the station after restoration and holds many community events there.
Let's give David a big hand.
Thank you.